Magic has a ton of cards with activated abilities, and a lot of these cards have had very unique costs. Lots of these cards have very splashy effects that do something really unique, or cards that experimented with very weird mechanics. Today, we're going to look at cards with the strangest cost to be able to activate them in the entire game. Starting us off at number 10, we have Necratog. This is a 1/2 Tog with a mana cost of 1 and 2 black. It is the ability where you can exile a top creature card of your graveyard to give a Tog +2/+2 until the end of the turn. Back in the old days of Magic, there were quite a few cards that care about the order of the cards in your graveyard, usually caring about the top creature card of your graveyard. Now, this ended up being a bit of an issue, specifically because maintaining graveyard order ended up being a real headache. Since you couldn't reorder your graveyard, it made trying to keep track of the cards in your graveyard a bit of a slog, especially with decks that like to put a ton of cards into your graveyard. While this mechanic hasn't shown up in decades, these cards are still legal for play in formats like Legacy, Vintage, and Commander. So technically, in those formats, under the Magic rules, you do still have to maintain proper graveyard order, though this is one of those rules that isn't enforced all too heavily thanks to how infrequent these cards are. Still, it's probably a good idea to keep in mind if you're ever playing a competitive setting, just in case. Now, the reason this card is only number 10 on this list is because it's not the only card with this kind of cast. The Zombie Scavengers also has a similar cost in its activated ability, so this isn't that unique of a cost. It's mostly on here because of the simple fact that we'll never get another card with this kind of cost again. And at number 9, we have Sinister Concoction. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 black. It has the ability where you can pay 1 black, mill 1 card, discard 1 card, pay 1 life, and sacrifice Concoction to destroy target creature. This is an interesting card, as the strange cost on this card is actually a pretty big flavor win. The idea is that you're mixing a bunch of ingredients to make a poisonous brew to destroy a creature, which is a pretty unique design for a card that we haven't seen very often. Not to mention, the exact costs they choose make a lot of sense considering the set Concoction was printed in. You see, Concoction was printed in Shadows of Innistrad, a set that had 2 big themes, Delirium and Madness. Delirium requires you to have 4 or more card types in your graveyard to get a bonus, and Madness lets you cast cards whenever you discard them. Concoction helps with both of these things, as it both lets you discard a card, mills you, gives you a chance to hit another card type for Delirium, and puts an enchantment into your graveyard when you sacrifice it. Enchantments are one of the least common types to end up in a graveyard, so this is a pretty big boon to your Delirium count. Despite these synergies, Concoction was pretty mediocre. It was a 2-mana removal spell that required you to lose card advantage, and even with Madness synergies, having to discard a card for Concoction was just too high of a restriction. And at number 8, we have Deathless Behemoth. This is a 6/6 Eldrazi creature with a mana cost of 6. It has Vigilance and has the ability where you can sacrifice 2 Eldrazi Scion tokens to return it from your graveyard to your hand, and you can only activate this ability as a sorcery. This is one of a handful of cards that requires you to sacrifice a specific type of token to activate its ability. This has only really started fairly recently with the introduction of a set-wide mechanics that all make the same kind of token. In Battle for Zendikar block, the Eldrazi got a bunch of cards that made these 1/1 Eldrazi Scion tokens that let you sacrifice them for mana to help you cast your big, scary Eldrazi creatures. This wasn't all that useful at the end of the day, as normal ramp spells ended up just being better most of the time. Interestingly, this is actually a revamp of the old Eldrazi spawn tokens that had the same ability but were 0/1s instead of 1/1s. There were a few other cards that ask you to have specific tokens lying around, such as Feasting Troll King and Tamiyo's Journal, but these cards can make the tokens you need themselves. Deathless Behemoth is one of the few cards that ask for specific tokens and can't make them itself, earning it a fairly low spot on this list. And at number 7, we have Mechtitan Core. This is a 2/4 artifact vehicle with a mana cost of 2. It has Crew 2, meaning you can tap creatures with total power of 2 or greater, and if you do, it becomes an artifact creature until the end of turn. It also has the ability where you can pay 5 and exile Mechtitan Core and 4 other vehicles and or artifact creatures you control to create a 10/10 legendary construct creature token with flying, vigilance, haste, lifelink, and trample that's all colors. That means it can't be blocked except by flyers or reach creatures, it doesn't tap to attack, it can attack the turn it enters the battlefield, any damage it deals causes you to gain that much life, and it can assign all excess combat damage to the opposing player when attacking. Finally, when that token leaves the battlefield, you return all the exiled cards except for Core to the battlefield under their owner's control. Well, after years of players calling their decks Voltron, Wizards decided to give us a reference as tongue-in-cheek as Shark Typhoon. While the setup required is pretty ludicrous, the payoff is also very high. The token Mechtitan gives you will often win you the game. And even if it doesn't, the 20 life swing it gives you from connecting once thanks to lifelink is a big enough tempo swing to keep you in the game. The biggest issue with this card is the token doesn't have any protection at all. It doesn't have any ward or any other protective keywords. Any removal spell is enough to destroy it. You do get your cards back, but if you're fine with that, why did you need the token in the first place? The card ultimately isn't very good, which is honestly fine because it's transparently a fun reference rather than a card meant to be a piece in the meta. And at number 6, we have Halo Fountain. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It is the abilities where you can pay 1 white, tap the fountain, and untap a tapped creature you control to make a 1/1 white citizen human creature token. You can pay 2 white, tap it, and untap 2 creatures you control to draw a card. And finally, the ability that gets fountain onto this list is the ability to pay 5 white, tap the fountain, and untap 15 creatures to win the game. One of the interesting things about this card is how it plays around with having costs that are actually an upside. You basically always want your creatures to be untapped. So, Fountain letting you untap your creatures does help you, but it is still a cost as it requires you to have tapped creatures to untap with it. This makes Halo Fountain a bit of a swingy card. It can sometimes not do much at all as you can't find a way to tap one of your creatures, but it can give you tons of value if you do have a board state. The final ability is the one that actually matters the least to the card's power level. Getting 15 creatures is so difficult that it basically never happens. And if you can get 15 creatures in the battlefield, you can usually just attack and win the game. After all, even if those creatures are just 1/1 tokens, that's enough damage to end the game on most board states late in the game. Not to even mention getting 15 tapped creatures. Now, while the card is extremely powerful, it hasn't really seen any play. It's just a bit too clunky and difficult to use to actually pull anything off with it. Still, thanks to its ridiculous alt-win condition, Halo Fountain earns a spot on this list. And at number 5, we have Etched Monstrosity. This is a 10/10 golem artifact creature with a mana cost of 5. It has the abilities where it enters the battlefield with 5 -1/-1 counters on it, and you can pay 1 mana of each color and remove 5 -1/-1 counters on it to have target player draw 3 cards. This is a card with a kind of simple idea that was implemented in a very unique way. It's basically a 5/5 that can turn into a 10/10 and draw you 3 cards for 1 mana of each color. The set the card was released in, Newbie, had the Infect mechanic in it. This is a keyword that makes sources with it deal damage in the form of -1/-1 counters to creatures and poison counters to players. This made it far more likely for Monstrosity to get its counters back after you remove them once. This meant the Monstrosity could, at least in theory, serve you as sort of a counter to Infect strategies. However, this didn't really work out, as your opponent would normally just either remove the threat or choose to not attack or block into the Monstrosity. Another way to take advantage of the intricacies of Monstrosity was using Proliferate. This is a keyword where you could choose any number of permanents or players with counters on them and give them an extra counter. If you could manage to proliferate a few times, you could give your Monstrosity more counters to let you draw more cards. However, proliferating was usually priced a bit too high for this to be practical. So, while there are a few ways to take advantage of the particular intricacies of the way the card was worded, but it was mostly just a 10 mana 10/10 that drew you 3 cards that you could pay in installments. This ended up not being anywhere near good enough for people to look at the card anywhere outside of something like Limited. And at number 4, we have Sphinx of the Chimes. This is a 5/6 Sphinx with a mana cost of 4 and 2 blue. It has flying and the ability where you can discard 2 non-land cards with the same name to draw 4 cards. Now, the ability to draw 4 cards for no mana is obviously very strong. But Sphinx's cost is one of the most awkward costs in the entire game. Since the playset size in Magic is 4, and the smallest your deck can be is 60 cards, having 2 copies of the same card in your hand doesn't happen all that often. Of course, anyone can attest to the fact that it does, in fact, happen. For an example, a card being legendary is often a pretty real downside, especially for cards with effects that could really get out of the hand if they could stack. Cards like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben would be more annoying than they already are if you could just slam more of them onto the board. On top of that, top decking a Thalia after you already cast one last turn does always feel pretty bad. Circling back to Sphinx, this is all to say that its ability to draw you cards won't really come up much unless you build around it. Normally, this is pretty difficult, but there are a few select cards in Magic that are really strong with Sphinx. Cards like Persistent Petitioners have this specific ability where your deck can have any number of said cards, regardless of the rules of the format you're playing. With this, you can play a deck full of tons of Petitioners to discard a Sphinx, easily ripping through your entire deck. Once your hand is full of useless cards, you could use cards like Mind Over Matter to untap your lands over and over for some sort of combo, or use a card like Seismic Assault to discard all of your lands to burn for damage. While this strategy is novel, it has one big obvious flaw, needing you to have a deck full of only one card. This means your deck isn't doing much for the rest of the game. It also means you can't play too many consistency booster cards like cantrips to help you find your Sphinx. So this strategy is obviously pretty boom or bust, and very easy to interact with. You're better off just trying to play some other all-in combo like Goblin Charbelcher. And at number 3, we have Arc-Slogger. This is a 4/5 beast with a mana cost of 3 and 2 red. It has the ability where you can pay 1 red and exile the top 10 cards of your library to deal 2 damage to any target. This is another card with a cost that encourages a very strange way of building your deck. With a 60 card deck, you're normally only going to be able to activate Slogger around 4 times before you're in danger of decking out. This is kind of a bummer considering just how strong this ability can be. Cards like Siege Gang Commander can deal the same amount of damage but require you to pay 2 mana and require you to give up some of your board state to do so. Siege Gang is a pretty strong card that has seen competitive success in the past. Slogger can pump out way more damage for the same amount of mana, letting it clean up your opponent's entire board and deal a ton of damage to their face. The downside is that it can't actually do this due to it eating up your entire library too quickly. However, there is a way to build around this. You can simply just play more cards in your deck. There's no real upper limit to how many cards a deck can have in Magic. The rule is that you must be able to shuffle your deck, unassisted, in a timely manner to play it in a tournament. This means you can easily play an Arc-Slogger deck with around 200 cards in it, allowing you to activate the ability around 18 times in the best case scenarios. However, this comes with the massive drawback of playing a 200 card deck. In just about every format, there really aren't enough playable cards to build a competitive deck with that many different cards in it. You'll have to start using the third or fourth best options for any job, and the loss of power and efficiency will be more than enough to put you behind in the game. Slogger is a very interesting card with a cost we haven't seen much in Magic, with the only few other cards with similar downsides like Demonic Bargain, which exiles the top 13 cards of your library when you cast it. And at number 2, we have Nivmagus Elemental. This is a 1/2 elemental with a mana cost of 1 hybrid red-blue mana, meaning it can be paid with either red or blue mana. It has the ability to exile an instant or sorcerer you control to put 2 +1/+1 counters on the elemental. Just to be clear, this means exiling the spell off the stack before it resolves to pump up your elemental, stopping you from getting whatever effect the card would have given you. Now, this usually isn't worth it, as most of the spells you're casting are better than simply pumping your elemental. Pump spells usually aren't that great, so turning all of your spells into one isn't necessarily the best idea. However, there are a few mechanics that combine perfectly with Nivmagus Elemental. The first is Replicate. What this allows you to do is pay a cost to copy a spell any number of times, and you can also choose new targets for the copies. So, with a card like Shattering Spree, if your opponent has one artifact you want to blow up, you can dump all your mana into that spree, getting a whole bunch of copies. Then, after one of them destroys the artifact, you can simply exile all the rest to pump up your elemental. Now, while this is strong, it has the issue of there not quite being enough good Replicate cards to pair with elemental. The other mechanic that pairs well with elemental is Storm. This is a mechanic where, whenever you cast a spell with Storm, you copy it for each other spell that was cast this turn. So if you cast a few cards before you cast your Storm spell, you get a huge elemental. The issue with this is that you're usually better off just trying to kill your opponent with the Storm spell you cast in the first place. Putting all of that into one creature makes you too weak to interaction, as they can simply kill the elemental. Now, while this is very unique, there's one card that really has to be at number 1 spot simply for how strange its costs were in the past, even if they've been cleaned up recently. And at number 1, we have Illusionary Mask. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It is the ability where you can pay X to choose a creature card with a mana cost that could be paid with some or all of the mana you spent on Illusionary Mask in your hand. You can cast that spell for free as a face-down 2/2 creature. Then, the creature becomes as the spell resolves as a lingering effect, where if it would deal or receive any kind of damage or become tapped, you instead turn it face up and then it receives or deals the damage or becomes tapped. And you can only activate this card as a sorcery. So, where do we start with this thing? First off, if you read the card on screen, you may have noticed that it works in an almost entirely different way from what I just described to you. This is because the card received an errata that substantially changed how the card functioned to be far less hard to work with. We'll go over the original version later, but the way the card works now is very strange. The idea is sort of like the morph mechanic it was originally worked into. However, unlike the morphs who all have a standardized cost of 3 colorless mana, Mask asks you to pay the full mana cost of the card you cheat out. This makes the whole element of surprise the card was going for much more difficult to pull off. So the card also has to let you overpay for the cards to try and hide what they are. Then it also has a very strange clause for when you flip the card over, as it needs to be a surprise while still in the battlefield as well. The act of casting the card is a bit strained, as you still need the right colors of mana, but your opponent can't verify if you're using the right colors until later. Morphs avoided this by simply requiring generic mana as their costs. Now, this would be enough to get the card this list, but the reason the card is at the top spot is how strange the ability was in the past. You see, in the past, the face-down card still had the characteristics of its face-up side, but those characteristics were all hidden from your opponent. This led to scenarios where your opponent would try to use a card like Terror on your creature, which couldn't kill artifact creatures or black creatures, and if they tried to target the creature you cheated out, you would simply tell them if they were allowed to or not. You didn't have to tell them why it wasn't a valid target, only that they weren't allowed to target it. It got even weirder with cards with activated abilities. But honestly, this ruling was changed so long ago and the card saw so little play that the exact uses of the card aren't that well known and are basically completely inapplicable to the current rule set of Magic. Now, while Mask doesn't have the strangest cost ever, the way that the cost interacts with the card's effect is one of the strangest in all of the game, and a design that Wizards has never even once returned to. I couldn't possibly not include the card, and once the card was on the list, it could only take the number 1 spot on the list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.